Welcome to MMO Graveyard, a new series in which we take a large look back at the past of previous MMOs and discover how they were successful, why they died off, what new innovations they brought to the MMORPG genre, the pinnacle of their successes, and their last living moments. Today, to mark the 5th episode of the series, we're going to take a long, in-depth special look into vanilla World of Warcraft. In the year 2001, over 15 years ago from today, which is actually hard to believe considering that it means some teenagers of today were not even alive at the time, World of Warcraft was announced for the very first time at the European Computer Trade Show. But what was World of Warcraft before it was World of Warcraft? Well, everybody knows what Warcraft is. If you don't, to sum it up in simple terms, it was a real-time strategy fantasy game released in 1994, which set off a game trilogy, with all games being set in the fantasy world of Azeroth. Each game proceeded to carry on the storyline of the previous games, and each introduced new features and content to improve gameplay. In the span of only 10 years, we got Warcraft 1, Warcraft 2, and Warcraft 3, along with the Frozen Throne expansion pack for Warcraft 3. And if we even go further back from Warcraft though, just to understand the roots of Warcraft, Blizzard originally actually wanted to attain the license of the Warhammer universe. The idea was that if they had the Warhammer universe, they would be able to create games which sell more due to the Warhammer name. In fact, Warhammer was probably the single biggest inspiration for the Warcraft universe, and you can see a lot of similarities between the two universes, particularly the humans vs. orc storyline and the fantasy characters such as high elves, dark elves, comparable to high elves and night elves, the dwarves obviously compared to dwarves, and chaos compared with the undead. Obviously the universes were quite a bit different, but you can see the inspiration that Blizzard took from Warhammer for creating its universe, and yes, you can even say that Warhammer took its own inspiration from J.R.R. Tolkien, so I guess you can kind of say that all these series have taken quite a bit of inspiration from each other, and it goes back thousands of years into history through Norse mythology, Greek mythology, and so on, so a lot of the things you see in Warcraft, Warhammer, Lord of the Rings are all inspired by mythology. Blizzard never attained the Warhammer license though, and instead opted to use their own original IP, which is how we got the Warcraft IP that has literally evolved over 20 years now. Through roughly around 7 years of successful Warcraft RTS games, Blizzard came up with the idea of making an MMORPG based on the Warcraft IP. If things went the other way, we could have possibly ended up with an MMORPG made by Blizzard set in the Warhammer universe, as weird as that sounds, but thankfully we got Warcraft instead. It was September 2001 when Blizzard executive Bill Roper had flown into London to make an announcement at the European Computer Trade Show. There was a lot of anticipation for what Blizzard was going to announce, as they had a few years prior announced Warcraft 3, and the announcement of a new Blizzard game was seen as a gigantic deal in the gaming industry. The studio at the time was known for releasing not many games, but working very hard on the games they did release. Blizzard always wanted to make sure the games they released were finished and done completely. They were seen as basically the perfectionists in the gaming industry, and people knew a Blizzard game was going to be a good game at the time, regardless of what it was. What everybody was expecting though was an announcement of StarCraft, but what they got was something that would literally define a generation for years to come and make the company more successful than they could have ever imagined. At that trade show, they played the very first trailer for their upcoming game, World of Warcraft. The game had started development in 1999, which means the game technically will be officially 20 years old in 2019 if you want to count development time. There was originally roughly only 50 developers working on the game, and the game was going to let players explore the Warcraft universe as their own character, and it was announced that there would be 3 playable races, humans, orcs, and Tauren, were revealed, and each were going to be fundamentally different from each other. Blizzard wanted the player to be able to play from a first person, third person, or a zoomed out isometric perspective. Believe it or not, most people at the time were kind of disappointed with the announcement, as the MMORPG genre was seen as being not that popular, and fans did not understand why Blizzard would waste their precious resources on it. Fans' concerns were how few people actually played MMORPGs at the time, and if Blizzard even really knew what they were getting themselves into. The fact was, most people were not interested in an MMORPG game, they wanted another RTS game set in the Warcraft or StarCraft universe. So where did Blizzard draw inspiration to make an MMORPG in the first place? Well, Sam Didier, the company's art director, stated, "I'm not sure if this is exactly where the WoW idea first started, but at one time we had a behind the character camera in Warcraft 3, much like you see in World of Warcraft now. We were thinking of a slightly different RTS/RPG vibe for the game, but we ended up going back more to the RTS side. But I remember seeing those first builds of the game, you running around with the Archmage or Blade Master, and right behind him with the camera perspective, you could see the horizon and the enemy camps in front. But I think that helped to establish the feeling that World of Warcraft, our game, would look awesome like this. I guess you can say this is what sort of sparked the idea for the game in the first place. A third person behind the character camera being experimented within Warcraft 3. Metzen also stated, at the time a lot of us were playing early MMOs like EverQuest and Ultimate Online. Well, we had a secondary development team working on an unannounced project, which we thought was cool, although it was still taking shape, but given that we were such fans of games like EverQuest, the discussion at the time was, well, maybe we can do one of these. And so they did. From 1999 to 2004, roughly around 5 to 6 years, the game was in development. As you can see from this early magazine here, these were some of their design philosophies, which included no load times between zones, no need to camp for crucial monsters, no insane downtime between fights, no food and drink to stay alive, though these things could help heal if used, and no focus on killing rats and rabbits. You can see from the magazine lots of different design concepts. You can see humans and Tauren banding together to fight gnolls, and it looks like they were going to make it so humans and orcs could play together as allies. It seems like the faction concept was not fully fleshed out yet in the game at this point, and there was also apparently going to be a ranger class, and it seems like Blizzard really wanted the race a player picked to play a gigantic factor when it came to major gameplay. It also seems at some point the game jumped from 3 races to 4 races, with Night Elves being added in. Blizzard also didn't want players making choices without any information beforehand, so the idea was for the player to pick a race first, then a class, and then jump into the game. They wanted to take the MMORPG genre and make it a little bit more casual, as they believed that the genre was currently too focused on the hardcore player and not enough on the casual player. Project lead Shane DeBerry was quoted as saying, "For lots of people, you gotta remember it's still scary going online, let alone playing an MMORPG game. We want to give players a ramp-up period to feel comfortable first." This quote alone really shows the difference of thought when it came to the internet back 15 years ago compared to now, as even the amount of people that owned computers was so much less than it is today, and people were way more cautious. In this picture you can see the very first showings of the UI. Some of the biggest things the devs wanted to focus on was the user interface, as most MMORPGs at the time had complex UIs, and a lot of the time was spent working around the UI instead of playing the actual game. Blizzard hoped to move the focus to the game world by offering a full open streaming world with no load times so that players could experience a smooth transition from zone to zone. No longer would MMORPG players be forced to endure long load screens when traveling between zones, and this was going to be the first true open world MMORPG. They didn't want players having to spend an hour luring a mob out of a zone and 10 minutes killing it. They wanted combat to happen faster and more often, with less downtime, and to be far less frustrating. They wanted the player to be able to jump in without allocating skill points first to their characters, and they wanted a smooth and simple transition into the game from day one. The land set Blizzard was going to enter was filled with competitive games like EverQuest and Anarchy Online, and while it was clear that Blizzard was prepared to enter the market, they without a doubt were not prepared for the success that was awaiting them and the generation they would change forever. Over the next 2 years, the game would change radically. Blizzard went from 3 races planned out and drawn to 4 races, and then to 8 races, and then separated the races within a faction system. There were going to be 7 classes for both factions, then 1 additional class for each individual faction, Paladin for Alliance and Shaman for Horde. On top of that, there were going to be 12 professions, 16 dungeons, and 2 raids at launch, all with their own unique themes, stories, and progression tiers. The level cap was going to be 60, and the game was designed to have more than enough content to last, and Blizzard had hoped the game would finally open up the genre to less hardcore-minded players and bring in the wide casual audience. Over the next few years, Blizzard began designing all the fundamental systems you see in the game today and building the game world from scratch. World of Warcraft was to be built using a modified engine from Warcraft 3, an engine that really came into its own as time went on. Beta started in early 2004 and a select few were lucky to test the game before launch. Prior to this year, the game had really started to gain a lot of hype, and the original website and its community began expanding and interest began increasing. This was at a time when the internet was not even close to as big as it is today, and the fact is, most players did not know what to expect from this game, but because it was connected to Warcraft, and because it was Blizzard, they were at the very least willing to give it a chance. The game had taken Blizzard at the time roughly around $63 million to make, according to Vivendi Universal, which made it one of the most expensive video games ever developed in 2004. With today's money though, the game falls around the middle of the spectrum when it comes to MMO development costs. For example, Star Wars The Old Republic and Elder Scrolls Online both cost more to develop by more than double the cost. In fact, many MMORPGs of today costed more to make than vanilla WoW, yet none of them were able to capture upon its success. Which goes to show it's not so much about how much money that goes into a game, but how much creative talent you have backing it, and how much heart and soul the developers put into it. Blizzard was entering an untested market that was not very popular, and they had the cards stacked against them for any hope of substantial profits, but somehow they made it through alive. If you were to ask any of the original developers if they thought the game was going to be as successful as it was, they would have told you no, not in their wildest dreams. This was a game that was going to turn Blizzard into a multi-billion-dollar company with thousands of employees and shape it for years to come. On that fateful day of November 23, 2004, the gaming industry would change forever. World of Warcraft was finally launched, and within that first day, over 200,000 players created World of Warcraft accounts. By 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, over 100,000 players were playing the game concurrently. These two record-breaking numbers made World of Warcraft the fastest-growing MMORPG in history at the time, and within a single day, all original 40-plus World of Warcraft servers were filled to capacity. The ship was completely full, and Blizzard had to take drastic measures to keep the ship from sinking. By the end of that Thanksgiving weekend, more than 40 additional servers were deployed to meet the rapidly growing player base, twice the amount of servers they launched with. As the number of new accounts and concurrent users continued to grow, the game was stressed to the maximum, and at the time 2004 tech was just not able to keep up. This was record-breaking for them, and the developers had no idea what to expect. Mike Moriham, president of Blizzard Entertainment, said, "Once we saw the numbers for the first day, we knew that we had to immediately increase capacity to accommodate the huge numbers of players joining our game. We're glad so many players are enjoying World of Warcraft, and we're dedicated to supporting a fun and smooth gaming experience for everyone." So what did the average computer a player used in 2004 look like? While many were still using the 4 to 3 CRT monitors, LCD did exist but just was not popular yet, and most laptops didn't have enough power to even run this game smoothly. Processor speeds were between 2 to 3.4 GHz, memory was around 1 to 4 GB of RAM, 3D cards had 256 to 512 megabytes of RAM, and people were using Windows XP, but some were still using Windows 2000 or earlier. The game had to be installed via CD/DVD drive, and the game was on 4 CDs, 5 if you got the Game of the Year edition, which needed to be installed, and then the patching had to happen. You could not download the initial game like you can today, and initial patch downloads could take an hour or more. Some players played via dial-up modem, and this made their characters jump around as they walked when viewed by other players in the game. And retailers across North America reported that World of Warcraft was unequivocally their biggest day one sales in PC gaming history. Leading industry retailers such as Walmart, Best Buy, EB, and GameStop all reported that hundreds of their stores sold out of World of Warcraft within the first day. There were also reports that Blizzard had to slow down production of the game boxes and leave the game sold out in stores, as they needed time to cope with the amount of players they already had stressing the servers. The fact is, Blizzard's forecasts for the game were simply wrong. The amount of players flooding servers were far too much for them to handle, and stores were selling out of the game fast, and online vendors were taking orders left and right. When they flipped the servers on, server queues reached the thousands for every single server, and the servers were crashing left and right. Players who did get in were greeted with latency issues and crashes. The entire launch was an utter fiasco. You can imagine how many players were upset at launch with how shaky it was, but the game was reported as being so good that it didn't even matter, as players were willing to wait days if it meant they could even get a few hours of gameplay in, and any players they did lose due to overloaded servers, they surely gained back in time. Imagine like 50 players waiting to kill one NPC, imagine servers being down for upwards to 3 days, imagine farming the same mobs for days just to complete one quest. It took roughly around 6 months to a year after launch for the game to even truly be smooth and complete working order. The game not only set major records and shaped a generation to come, it defined the future of MMORPG launches, raised expectations for games of the future, and finally brought in the mass market and gamers to the genre. Let's take a look at why this game did so well. World of Warcraft was like no other game before it. Yes, it was an MMORPG, yes there were some similarities with other MMORPGs on the market like EverQuest, but the game took such a wildly different approach and did things so much differently that it's really hard to compare the game to others at the time. To really understand World of Warcraft's successes, you have to understand how it changed the genre so radically. Unlike other MMOs on the market at the time, this was a game that even the most basic player could log into. There was no overly complex UI present that the game developers expected the player to work around, and it took mere seconds to get into this game world, and the game world itself was a large streaming world with no loading screens to boot. The game didn't expect the player to do any sort of research on skill allocating at character creation, and it gave the ultimate control to the player while giving them the ability to make even the most complex decisions without any significant research. In most other MMORPGs, you had to spend months learning the systems, the UI, the game world itself, and you had to understand how the mechanics came together to even fully play the game. But in World of Warcraft, the game felt so much more fluid and natural to any player willing to pick it up. The player could know practically nothing but still be able to make their way through the game world and have a great experience doing so. It's this opening that it gave to the casual audience that contributed so much to its success. It made the player through its beautifully created game world feel like they were in a different place, and I believe that this is the feeling that most players try to describe when first remembering their vanilla experiences. It wasn't the gameplay itself or the game's wonderfully defined systems, it was the immersion of the login screen, the music, the character creation screen, the opening scenes, and the way the game immersed the player and made them feel like they were living and breathing inside a completely different world. There was nothing before like this when this game first came out. Even if this was the player's first, second, or third MMORPG, it gave the player a new feeling of playing something different. So many of this game's systems were new to the genre, and the systems that weren't new were done so much better in this game, notably the character creation, game world, and questing experiences and endgame experiences, just to mention a few. Players familiar to the genre just didn't know what a fully fleshed out, well thought out, and properly executed MMORPG looked like until vanilla World of Warcraft. The game was an adventure, an experience that took the player around a beautifully designed game world. Upon logging in, players would see this huge, beautiful portal, then a server selection screen, and from that screen they would choose a faction, and from that faction a race and class. This game allowed the player to define who they were and what they wanted to be. The game had 4 races per faction, all with different starting experiences and racial abilities. Almost every race in this game had its own fully fleshed out starting experience that put them in different places into the game world. This added to the gigantic feel of the world with massive zones and so much to discover. For example, if you were a Night Elf entering Stormwind for the first time, you would feel out of place and players would recognize the journey you took to get there. Or if you were a Tauren entering Undercity for the first time, you would get that similar feeling. Every decision, every choice, the entire journey of your character held meaning. The class you picked would have class-based quests as you leveled through the story, which provided means of expanding on your class lore. You would feel the lore and story of your race from the questing zones you were in, but also the class in which you were leveling felt just as meaningful. Paladins and Warlocks had their own class mount quests, the only classes in the game to have their own unique mounts. There were real class differences, and it made a huge impact on the way the player experienced the game. The decisions you made had consequences and meaning, and you felt that more so as you continued your journey through the game world. At level 10, you would be opened up to skill trees where you would spec your character to your liking through 3 different class specializations that sometimes focused on different roles, depending on which class you picked. Every point you would get was with a level, and every level meant that your character was progressing. Every second playing the game had meaning, and every player in the world were progressing together at different speeds. It was this feeling of playing in a world bigger than yourself, in a world that even had different political underlyings as the faction you picked was at war with the other faction, that made this game so epic in nature. Your towns could be raided, your cities could be trashed by enemy players, and your faction king could be killed, and you would hate the other faction for it. There was such a high level of faction pride and hatred and meaning that players put behind the factions they picked. Players were at war with each other, separated by a faction system that separated them. It brought players of the same faction closer together, as these were the players you were going to be progressing with and working with, and servers were cut off from each other, so this meant that whatever server you picked to progress on was going to be full of players you would get to know over possibly even years of playing. It was possible to be that player that thousands of players on your server hated.
Who else wants it other than rogues? Because all the rogues can't go on it. Khan, what are you doing?
What the fuck? Oh my god.
What the fuck?
Oh my god.
I'm going to kill myself right now. See ya.
Get rid of him and go.
You piece of shit! You piece of shit! I can't believe you. Oh my god.
Wow, man.
And he has my motherfucking gloves too. That fucker.
Hey, screen
Well.
share the forums, guys.
Oh,
happens.
That was a Lawbringer helmet. Holy shit.
And even the player that thousands of players on your server liked. You could build a name for yourself in this game, just like you could build a name for yourself in real life.
Usually do.
Alright, thumbs up.
Ready, guys?
Let's do this. Leroy Dragons!
Oh my god, he just ran in. Save him!
Oh geez, stick to the plane!
Oh Jesus, let's go, let's go. Stick to the pledge,
Stick to the plane!
Oh gee, oh fuck. Give me divine intervention. Hurry up.
Shout.
He's saying I can't cast. I can't move, am I lagging guys? I can't move. What the hell? I can't hear you. Oh my god. Oh, just keep spawning, more respawning. I don't think you can cast with that shit. Oh my god. Shout.
We got him, we got him.
Take it off. I got it. Take it off.
Come on, stay down.
Oh my god.
God damn it, Leroy.
God damn it.
Leroy,
Leroy, you moron.
Leroy.
Geomoose.
This is
I'm on
ridiculous.
it. So mass. I'm down, forking down. God damn it. I got killed before I could remove all this. God. Oh,
See,
Spiffy, res us.
Why do
Spiffy,
you
res
do
us.
this shit, Leroy?
I'm trying.
It's not my fault.
Who's soul stoned?
We do have a soul stone up, don't we?
Anthony, do you got soul stones?
Warlock.
Oh god.
Oh, for...
Great job,
What's
guys.
up?
For
What's
Christ's
up?
sake. Leroy, you were just stupid as hell. Over him.
At least I have chicken.
We can look at so many things this game did better than other MMOs, from its character creation to game world to questing to the entire leveling experience to dungeons to raids and even to the UI. But it wasn't so much these things specifically that made this game great, it was the fact that this game brought so many players together in ways that no other game had done before it. This was a social experience just as much as it was a game experience. It is likely by level 60 the player would have built strong, long friendships with other players and progressed through so many different dungeons, and even maybe have had the possibility of joining a guild and having been ready to take on raids. Raids were a massive get-together of 40 players, all with different roles, coordinating to take down bosses much more powerful and stronger than themselves individually. Outside of these massive get-togethers, players could also engage in 1 vs 1 PvP combat, or get together in PvP raids and attack enemy towns and cities for fun, or jump into a more competitive PvP side of the game through battlegrounds and earn ranks and titles for their character, which required thousands upon thousands of hours to progress through, which unlocked gear rewards. In this game, you could tell which players had contributed the most amount of time to the game and which players were the most skilled through the gear that they were wearing. Like I said, players all started as equals, but those who put in the time and effort rose above the rest. It gave inspiration to other players as they had hoped to one day be able to achieve such great gear and success one day for themselves, and made them truly understand and feel like it was possible for them as well. There were no pay barriers, no paywalls, and the only things required to be successful in this game was time and effort. This game also had a massive economy and profession system backing it, with 12 different professions to pick from. For the player who maybe wanted to focus more on the economy and not so much on the raiding or PvP, this game offered high rewards for them as well. Players were able to progress through crafting professions and sell things on the auction house, giving them gold, which they could then use to buy or make crafted gear for themselves. This brought an entirely different social experience to the game, as players came to know the players who had the most gold and traded with them the most, and who focused the hardest on the auction house, as the auction house was tied to the server the players played on, and every server had its own unique economy, and economies could differ quite a bit between servers. There was this feel of community in the game that just was not present in most other games. This was a game that forced players to work together, a game that rewarded players for working together, a game where you could build lifelong friends and even relationships that could translate through into real life. Like I said, this game was just as much a social experience as it was a gameplay experience. Even if you hated the gameplay of the game itself, you could come to appreciate the community of the game. People who would just hang out around Goldshire or outside the major cities and sit and talk and just enjoy each other's company and presence. A game where even the most loneliest people in real life had a home to call their own, an ability to make a name for themselves and not be held down by their real life circumstances. Ultimately, this game brought millions of people together, for better or for worse. This was entirely a different world that you could live through and experience. But the success of a game is also determined through sales. So how successful was this game from a financial standpoint? Well, within its first year, from November 2004 to November 2005, the game attained 5 million subscribers and upwards to around 7 to 8 million prior to its first expansion launch. It won Game of the Year awards on GameSpot and other sites, and many other awards also. It generated so much revenue that Blizzard was able to expand as a company and provide even further support to the game as time went on. Financially, this game is the most successful game to ever release, with over $10 billion generated in revenue. This game paved the way for so many other companies to start making their own MMORPGs, as it proved the potential of the MMORPG genre to investors and big companies who before saw the MMORPG genre as having little potential. This was the game that defined the MMORPG genre from this point forward. World of Warcraft at launch was simply far ahead of its time and offered the best online gaming experience ever created in a video game. This is simply an undeniable fact that even the people who hate the game the most have learned to come to accept in time. Everything we imagine the game could have done better is seen through the eyes of 2016 goggles. But in 2004 and 2005, any flaws you could possibly see with the game were nothing in comparison to the great things this game did that made it worth playing. Let's take a look at the less perfect things this game did and some of its flaws. So there's going to be a lot of people mad at me for saying this, but it's really hard to point out any real significant failures to the game. I mean, yes, if I look through the glorious goggles from 2016, it's easy to see where the game could have been better, but using 2016 standards on a 2004 game is just unfair. The questing experience, for example, in 2016 terms, was simply too grindy, with bad drop rates, and there was so much zone inconsistency in the amount of quests available that many players were forced to grind through levels from just killing the same mobs over and over again just to get a level up and just to get to the next zone that might offer possibly some more quests for the player to go through. The level flow was not perfect in this game, but you have to understand at the time, it was still leagues better than every other game out there. At least if we're talking about MMORPGs in specifics. With 2004 standards though, the level flow in this game was near perfect and meant to be challenging. It was meant to force the player to get out and explore the game world and not just offer a linear path of progression. In fact, there were a lot of quests found through exploration in this game and a lot of things for the players to discover. There was definitely without a doubt some incomplete zones, like a Sheriff for example, that really offered the player nothing, but it wasn't such a bad thing considering that a lot of these zones were seen as mysterious and left the player wondering. It kind of added to the structure of the world and made the player realize that no, not all zones are equally as important, but they do exist and are there for you to explore. The lack of logical flow of quests and a lot of those older questing design philosophies, though, would simply not work in today's game design world, and that's okay, because we're looking at a 2004 game. Then there was the raiding experience. Gathering 40 players was difficult, and keeping them all playing long enough and happy to down bosses was equally as hard. On the flip side, there were a lot of players that loved the raiding experience with 40 players, and regardless of where you stand on this as being a failure of the game or not, the system still worked and many players progressed using it. So I mean, I can't really count it as a large failure considering it was more of an annoyance of getting 40 players together and making them stay, rather than something that destroyed the gameplay specifically. One of the major annoyances of the raiding experience though were the raid-wide buffs. Having to ensure everybody had exactly the right buffs and making sure they were constantly being refreshed required a lot of coordination and was quite the annoyance. Then there is the fact that roughly every class had like one spec that was actually viable, and I mean viable in terms of number crunching and rating at least. If you wanted to be a competitive player, you were forced into certain specs that mathematically were proven as superior to other ones. Also, if you wanted to quest alone, good luck doing so as a healer or a tank, as there really was no dual specialization, and it really required a lot of time and effort on your part to go out and respec. This is why it wasn't so uncommon back in the day to see Ret Paladin tanks or Feral Druid healers while leveling. Players were practically forced, if playing solo, to spec into DPS if they wanted to be able to quest. On the flip side to this, it kinda did give the player more control over their character though, as they could potentially spec halfway into DPS and halfway into healing, and kind of do both to get through the leveling experience, as odd as that may sound. As unforgiving as the game may have been, again from the standpoint of 2004, it's hard to fault its game design here because it was already such a gigantic step up from other games, and players back then didn't really notice the unforgiving things as much because of it. No, not every class was viable. No, not every spec was viable, Ret Paladins for example. Yes, there were a lot of stupid mechanics, such as gearing for raid instances often meant wearing gear that was bad, prepping for Molten Core and Blackwing Lair involved finding fire resist gear, which often had little in terms of other stats, and another thing would be your entire raid guild needing the Onyxia skin cloak to absorb an ability from Nefarion so that you didn't instantly die. Most of your raid would also have to run Meridon, and the first set of non-raid epics were so difficult to attain that most raid guilds were well past the point they were valuable enough by the time they could actually get them in the first place. And the rank of Healing Touch a Druid God at level 60 was less valuable than the one they learned back at level 10, because the level 10 one had a shorter cast time, and in terms of health healed per points of mana spent, blew it out of the water, so you would basically spam down ranked Healing Touches. Similarly, other low ranked spells often trumped high ranked spells for casting priority. Itemization was also bad too, and class balance also suffered as a large amount of class specs at the high level were seen as not being viable. Players being forced into roles just to play, or being forced to re-roll if they didn't like it, back when re-rolling meant a month plus of leveling. The game was just so goddamn unforgiving and brutal in many of these aspects. The fact is, vanilla World of Warcraft was by no means perfect, but back in 2004 it was seen as so close to it that it didn't even really matter. Any issues with the game were overshadowed with how fun it was and how great the experience of the game was. It's hard to even truly find any bad reviews for the game written back in 2004, as the negatives critics gave it were generally related around some bugs that needed to be worked out, or them citing the same things I've mentioned, such as quest grinding. A lot of the bad critic reviews seem to have more of a problem with the MMORPG genre itself as a whole than the game itself. In conclusion, I think the game's biggest failure was its rough launch period. It took a good year for Blizzard to kink out the bugs and fix server performance issues. If the game were not as good as it was, I think a lot of players would have given up on it. It really had one of the worst launches in the history of video games if you want to talk about server performance issues and unplayability. Using the 2016 goggles, it's easy to see the flaws: the rough illogical questing experience, no instant quest text, many class specs being unviable at endgame, weird raiding mechanics, bad itemization, shaky class balance, and performance issues. But back in the day, these things were seen as so much more minor than they would be if the game were to be released today. I still fault the game for some of these bad game design decisions, but I don't believe they detracted enough from the experience the game offered to truly harm the game itself. So what is the future of the game? Well, unfortunately, as it stands in the time of this video in 2016, there's really no way to play vanilla World of Warcraft. The largest server called Installarius that was available is unfortunately not around anymore and shut down by Blizzard. I can't really recommend players jumping onto private servers either due to the legality of it all, and the fact that most of them do not replicate the true vanilla experience anyway, and the chances are they will be closed down by Blizzard if they get big enough to warrant it. It kind of makes them not worth playing on. So in terms of playing the game right now, it's kind of, well, impossible. The only option you have is really playing the current version of the game, and the current version of the game is so drastically different from the vanilla experience that it's kind of like playing a different game to begin with. So I don't really consider playing the current version of the game as the same as playing the vanilla version of the game. They're just so completely different. On the bright side, the Nostalrius team did sit down with Blizzard and a petition was signed with over 1 million people pledging their support for a vanilla legacy server to Blizzard, and the market is clearly there for one, so I think Blizzard is well on their way to making one happen, and that if you're watching this video in 2017 or 2018, there might actually be an official vanilla server for you to play on. So for anybody really watching this video after 2016, please check to see if there is a legacy server released, and if so, I would recommend playing on it, as well it won't give you the same experience it gave players back in 2004 due to player expectations being so much lower back then, and players not being used to playing the big budget games in today's world. It is still very much a great experience for anybody looking to play a fun MMORPG. The biggest and really only true reason in my opinion that vanilla World of Warcraft is superior to current WoW is because of the community, and if that community can even be slightly close to replicated, as it was on the server Nostalrius, the vanilla experience would well be worth checking out for anybody. Vanilla World of Warcraft will go down in history as one of the greatest games ever created. You can bet your ass that this game will be in the history books hundreds of years from now as one of the biggest social MMORPG experiences, if not the first biggest social true MMORPG experience ever, and that a lot of people will learn a lot of things from this game in the future. And really, in many ways, this game played a large part in defining my teenage years, and I can't thank Blizzard and these developers enough for providing that experience, as without it, I might not be the person I am today, as weird as that sounds. As always, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this special episode on Vanilla World of Warcraft. I will be taking a look at the WoW expansions individually in the future, so if you would like to see that content, please subscribe and support the channel, as the more support this channel gets, the longer I will be able to keep doing this. For the 6th episode of the series, we'll be taking a look at Elder Scrolls Online. Please, if you would like for me to cover any specific MMORPGs, let me know in the comments.